It's Monday, November 9th. If you thought I'd be waiting for January, well, day one is today. We start here. President-elect Joe Biden isn't waiting for a phone call from President Trump.
Tackling the pandemic, working on an economic recovery, climate change, and racial equality.
He's starting to put campaign promises into action this morning. While the votes were coming in, his biggest problem was only getting worse.
Several days now, we've hit death tolls that have surpassed 1,000 people a day.
In the midst of a pandemic, could a chaotic transition lead to even more deaths? And you thought the Democrats were frustrated with each other during the primary?
You're going to see these fault lines as it relates to what should the plan for the Green New Deal going forward? What should be the tax plan going forward?
Not seeing blue states or red states sounds great until you're trying to get something through Congress. From ABC News, this is Start Here. I'm Brad Milkey. There's always a question of when do you actually become the president-elect of the United States? Like, is it decided by a news organization? No. We have panels of experts who do really intense analysis of the vote, so we can get you the news quickly, but it's not like we have official authority on anything. Is it the states? Well, technically, yeah. Once they count every vote, they certify their results, they pick the official electors, but that doesn't happen for weeks, and the transition really needs to get underway immediately. There's actually a small group within the federal government who starts paying for the transition of power to take place. But what do they do if there's no agreement?
Well, I think that is way premature. At this point, we do not know who has prevailed in the election.
Yesterday, with President Trump still not conceding the 2020 election and GOP allies telling him to hold out.
There's a lot of shenanigans going on here. If I were President Trump, I would take all this to court. I'd fight back.
The rest of the world just started to move on. Some senators, not just the Mitt Romneys of the world, some GOP stalwarts said it is time to start accepting these results.
Former President George W. Bush calling to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden.
Former Trump advisor Gary Cohn tweeted his congratulations. You really know it's done when foreign governments start welcoming the new commander-in-chief. And Joe Biden got that message yesterday from none other than one of Trump's most trusted foreign allies, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So despite tight margins still in Arizona and Georgia and silence from this White House, we're doing this. Joe Biden has enough electoral votes to move on here, but what is he moving toward? We're going to spend the morning figuring out his next hours, his next days, and the next several weeks to break down what you're about to see here. Let's go to the person who covered this entire campaign from beginning to end. ABC's Mary Bruce might have just set the record for most time standing in the parking lot of the Chase Center in Wilmington, Delaware. Mary, glad you're back. Hope you're okay.
Glad to be talking to you finally out of the parking lot, Brad.
Yeah, exactly. Glad you made it. There was so much effort. There was so much money, so much waiting from people, all spent on whether Joe Biden could win this thing. Now that he has won this thing, what do you do? Like, literally, what happens next now?
What happens now is he gets to work, right? They are not waiting. Despite the fact that the president still hasn't conceded, they're forging ahead. So today, the president-elect is going to be announcing his team of scientists and experts to tackle this pandemic. But the to-do list is massive.
We will act on the first day of my presidency to get COVID under control.
And you can get a sense of it, actually, if you go and look at his new website. They've unveiled their new official transition website, buildbackbetter.com.
We'll act to pass my economic plan that will finally reward work, not wealth in this country.
And it centers on those four priorities that he's spoken of all along: tackling the pandemic, working on an economic recovery, climate change, and racial equality. Those are not small issues to try and tackle. And then, of course, there's the lengthy list of things that he has said he wants to undo on day one.
We're going to protect dreamers and their families.
A lot of President Trump's most controversial actions, like the so-called Muslim ban and rejoining the Paris Climate Accord.
On day one, I'm going to send Congress a bill for immigration reform. We'll focus on keeping families together. It's about families, including providing a clear roadmap to citizenship.
The question for Joe Biden and his team is going to be, how do you prioritize this? Because that's a really busy day one.
Well, and this kind of speaks to that. If we know what his goals are, do we know who he would hire to enact them? I mean, do we have a sense of who's going to be in his cabinet or what kind of names are being tossed around or who he's got to go to first?
There are a lot of names flying around. A lot of people, I'm sure, in Washington raising their hand, eager to join a Biden administration. Look, the way this traditionally goes, and I think it's worth stressing that a transition, there is a pretty set process for this. A lot of questions about how much the Trump administration is going to participate in this. But so far, the two teams have been talking, even in the run-up to this. Traditionally, the first person you pick is your chief of staff. Then he would go about filling some of those key White House positions. Then you get to the cabinet. So there's a long road ahead and just hundreds and hundreds of positions to be filled, not to mention, getting acquainted with the agencies, figuring out where various policies stand. So the transition is a huge task in and of itself.
Hey, Eric, looking back on this campaign, because you were there for all of it, and there's so many moments along, a year and a half, 2 years of campaigning, but was there a particular inflection point for you, either from Biden or maybe from Donald Trump himself, where Biden's people are like, oh, that's why we won right there. Like, we could have screwed that up, but we didn't.
I think when you look back at the campaign, from a bird's eye point of view, there are a couple key inflection points.
Originally, I had my support behind Biden. And now I'm not so sure.
Not that long ago, many people were writing off Joe Biden's campaign. He had an embarrassing finish in Iowa. It didn't look like he was going to be able to come back from those early contests.
But then along came South Carolina.
And then in stepped Jim Clyburn. There's a reason he's known as the kingmaker in South Carolina, and his endorsement was critical.
Biden racked up nearly 50% of the vote, almost 30 points ahead of the second-place finisher, Bernie Sanders. So what does this mean for Super Tuesday, now just 2 days away?
And with the support he got from black voters in that state, especially black women, well, that really saved Joe Biden's campaign and catapulted him to the nomination and to the White House.
And especially for those moments when this campaign was at its lowest ebb, the African-American community stood up again for me. You've always had my back, and I'll have yours.
So essentially, these police you see right here, and they're advancing again.
When you look at things that the president may have done, I think many would say that a turning point was that moment with the president crossing Lafayette Park.
And as police move in, they fire tear gas on the crowd. While inside the grounds of the White House, a remarkable split screen. The president claiming to be an ally of peaceful protesters.
I am your president of law and order.
Heading across what's now known as Black Lives Matter Plaza, holding up that Bible in front of the church. I mean, that really was a turning point in this race. Of course, also how the pandemic just upended everything. I mean, I think it was a risk. A lot of people sort of scratched their heads and said, what's Joe Biden doing spending so much time off the trail? The president mocked him for campaigning from his basement.
And they just announced he is leaving to make a speech. He's going to make it in Delaware. He always makes it in Delaware. About 3 minutes from his basement.
The big difference between us and the reason why it looks like we're not traveling, we're not putting on super spreaders.
They were adamant, though, that was the right strategy. They felt that having the president soak up a lot of the oxygen early in the pandemic would only help them. And that's a strategy that proved in many ways to be correct. So there are always forces, in a campaign, both internal, external, things that your opponent do that all can shape a race.
Mary Bruce found herself indoors, finally, somehow. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brad. We'll always have the parking lot.
Okay, so if the first priority is COVID-19, what actually has to happen? Let's go to ABC's Ann Flaherty, who covers federal agencies. And Ann, I feel like this is the first time in, a week that I'm not talking about electoral math. Meanwhile, the math surrounding COVID-19 has only gotten scarier. Where do we stand? Can you catch us up?
Well, Brad, we're looking at case numbers that are rivaling what we saw in the spring, and the death count is following close behind.
Record number of Americans hospitalized this week in 22 states.
Take a look at the new numbers. Nearly 10 million people infected, more than 1 million cases added in just the last 10 days.
Several days now, we've hit death tolls that have surpassed 1,000 people a day. That really is startling when you consider that it's been months since we hit those peaks back in spring, and it does seem that people are just really tired.
In Massachusetts, the state enacting a 9:30 p.m. curfew on restaurants, movie theaters, and gyms.
They're tired of social distancing. Maybe they're not wearing masks, but it just does seem to be ticking upward.
How should Joe Biden envision this pandemic? Not just today, but like on January 20th, right? That's when he would take office. How is he going to have to prepare for that?
Right. Well, it's really interesting because I think that Biden isn't looking at January 20th. I think he's looking at now.
This is about telling the American people the truth, letting the scientists speak, listening to the science, and stepping out of the way.
So today, Biden is expected to announce a task force. He's going to put two gentlemen in charge, Vivek Murthy, who is Obama's former Surgeon General, and David Kessler, who's a former FDA chief. He wants to eventually set up a pandemic dashboard where people can look up their zip code and see how bad the coronavirus is in their area.
It's not just the folks in the White House or who travel with me that deserve regular testing. Every single American deserves safety and peace of mind.
He's also talking about testing. He really wants to increase testing dramatically, particularly at-home tests. He wants to invest in this. He says he's invoking FDR, kind of how back in World War II, there was a big push to get the country to focus on building tanks and planes. He wants to focus on building at-home tests that will dramatically change how we see this pandemic.
And what do you say to Americans who say, this is my freedom, my choice whether to wear a mask? Are you going to force them to wear a mask?
This isn't about freedom. It's about freedom for your neighbors. It's about a patriotic responsibility.
And the thing I'm not hearing you say is national mask mandate, national closures. Are those on the table here?
That's right. I don't think that there's a way that he can enforce that.
There's a question whether or not a president under the Constitution could mandate everyone wear a mask.
One of the things that his plan talks about is trying to get governors on board with enforcing masks and leaving that up to local authorities to try to enforce it.
What I would be doing is putting as much pressure as I could on every governor, every senator, every mayor, every county executive, every local official, and everyone in business, putting pressure on them to say what you're doing is irresponsible.
The scientists are definitely on board with this, but the question is, how do you do it? And in places where, Biden might not be that popular politically.
They prolong the pandemic. That's all I hear about now. That's all I hear. Turn on television. Right? COVID. A plane goes down. 500 people dead. They don't talk about it. COVID. By the way, on November 4th, you won't hear about it anymore.
Okay, so then my next question then, Ann, is obviously, sure, we can talk about how Joe Biden's getting ready right now. Great. But a lot of this relies still on President Trump, right? Is there a plan from the White House, the current White House, to keep more Americans from dying?
Right. Well, President Trump has mostly disbanded his own White House task force. It still exists, but they're not talking to President Trump. He hasn't had an interest in this particular task force in a while. He's mostly left it up to the governors.
The White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, has tested positive for COVID-19.
He made headlines with this concession that the administration is no longer trying to control the rapidly spreading virus.
We're not going to control the pandemic. We are going to control the fact that we get vaccines, therapeutics, and other mitigation.
Why aren't we going to get control of the pandemic?
Because it is a contagious virus.
I think that one thing you could see that happens with President Trump is he still holds the keys to the federal agencies, and Biden needs that. His transition team, they need to be briefed. This is a transition period where these agency review teams arrive at the doorstep of FDA and CDC, and they start to get some real firsthand accounts of what is happening on the ground now. So one way that President Trump could really make this messy for the president-elect and the incoming administration is to not let them in, essentially.
But what do you mean by not letting them in? What does that mean, though?
Well, it's interesting. So GSA, which is the General Services Administration, it's an agency that basically everybody's ignored their entire lives. Nobody really pays attention to them. They lease office space. They help sort of the logistics and acquisition of the government. They're the ones that actually hold on to the money. There's $9.9 million that's designated, it's taxpayer dollars, to pay for the transition. Things like vetting new cabinet officials who will be advising President Biden come January. But it is up to them to let them in, essentially. I mean, physically let these Biden staffers in to get briefed by the federal agencies. And these are career staff at the agencies who are really experienced in this and can sit down with the Biden team and say, these are the issues at hand that you're going to be dealing with from day one when you take over.
All right, high-stakes stuff. And like you said, getting higher. This is not something that's just going to stay the same between now and January 20th. Ann Flaherty, thanks so much.
Thanks, Brad.
Next up on Start Here, President Obama figured with his big win, Republicans would want to cut some deals. Is Joe Biden really going to go with the same plan? Back after the break.
Let this grim era of demonization in America begin to end here and now.
There are going to be lots of postmortems, analysis on each of these campaigns, trying to figure out how Joe Biden won, why President Trump lost. One thing is clear, though. Both of these men convinced more people to turn out for them than had ever turned out for any other American candidate. They rank 1 and 2 in total votes. That gets tricky because when it's close like this, any group of people can conceivably claim, we made the difference. Take progressives. They can say, hey, if Bernie Sanders had not energized the left like he did, Joe Biden, you would have lost that election. Those disaffected Republicans like the Lincoln Project and others can say, hey, we convinced 8% of Republicans to turn their back on the president. It's not a ton, but that's what put you over the top. Black and brown voters. Everyone wondered if they would show up in larger numbers than 2016. That was arguably the difference in mail ballots in these big cities. And then you've got moderates, independents, people in the middle of the road who can also say, look, we have now seen what it looks like when the far left all shows up for a candidate. And guess what? On its own, that probably still wouldn't have been enough to beat Donald Trump this year. They'd be right. So if everyone feels like they're the reason you won, who do you prioritize? And how do you unify the Democratic Party, let alone the country? Let's go to someone who's had to cross that party divide through most of her political career. Former Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp joins us from North Dakota. Senator Heitkamp, you're a moderate Democrat. What does Biden need to do first to actually get some forward momentum with everyone here?
Well, I think he's already done it. I think that he has repeatedly said his main goal is to unite the country for the soul of the country, build back all the country better.
This is part of the mandate given to us from the American people. They want us to cooperate in their interest. And that's the choice I'll make. And I'll call on Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike, to make that choice with me.
One bit of advice that I have is get out of the Beltway. The Beltway is all about power. You know, everybody's jockeying and throwing elbows and they want to see their name in the paper or whatever it is, or they want to get that quick quip that'll get them the fundraising appeal. You know, that's just not governing. And so I have recommended over and over and over again that he get out of the Beltway, that he go and talk to governors. When he's talking about criminal justice reform, he talks to state prison authorities and to law enforcement, to local organizing groups like Black Lives Matter, not the lobbying groups in Washington, D.C.
Democrats will keep their majority in the House of Representatives, but it could shape up to be the slimmest majority in decades.
This has been a life or death fight for the fate of our democracy, as he says, the soul of our country. We did not win every battle in the House, but we did win the war.
Well, and I'm sure Democrats of all stripes are excited right now, if not that Joe Biden won, that at least President Trump lost. But, I mean, you've got people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying, okay, we did not just do this to beat President Trump. We've got a very progressive agenda, and we're going to hold your feet to the fire. At what point does the kumbaya moment end within the Democratic Party?
You know, you're going to see these fault lines as it relates to what should the plan for the Green New Deal going forward, what should be the tax plan going forward, what should be the economic goals going forward.
What Congress must do with President Biden is move aggressively and rapidly on an agenda that stands for working people And for low-income people,
these are the places where Democrats come together, and not just on the goal, but a lot of times on what we need to do to accomplish the goal, like a reasonable minimum wage, like making sure that people can afford their health care, making sure that we're moving forward on things like good quality schools and affordable higher education. So I think that you're going to see maybe some fault lines along the way on tactics, but not a lot of fault lines on goals.
Well, okay, so then say you actually do get Democrats on the same page. We heard yesterday from Terry Moran that, Joe Biden is this traditional transactional politician, as in he's ready to make a deal across the aisle. But what if Mitch McConnell and Republicans in the Senate are like, nah, like we're fine? Does this just become a presidency then where Biden is signing a bunch of executive orders and just overturning Trump stuff? That's all they can do.
Everybody is like the Senate. Think about this. Think about when you get a governor who is fighting with Joe Biden for COVID relief. What's the partisanship going to be when that governor says to their senators, I need this to happen and you need to help make this happen? Whether it is Mike DeWine in Ohio.
Let's get back to focusing on what we have to and get this virus down. And
who I think obviously should have some influence over Rob Portman. You've got to build support for that.
If Joe Biden called you, what would be your best advice on how to work with the nation's governors, Democrat and Republican, on this crisis?
I'd say send all the governors a very clear message about what you want the national policy to be.
And I'm saying that it's really awfully hard when you have to go through Mitch McConnell.
What this administration and this Republican Senate has done is exercise the power that was given to us by the American people.
Mitch McConnell famously said, my job is to make sure Barack Obama isn't a two-term president. And it was obstruct. So you've got to go past him and deal with individual members on what their goals are and say, okay, what's concerning to you in your state and how can we help change the outcome?
Senator Blunt and I have worked well together on a wide range of issues, from national service to behavioral health.
You have to reach across the aisle. You have to find in almost every Senate somebody on the other side to get things done.
Keep your eye on the goal, whether it is building back infrastructure, whether it is making sure that working people have a fair break and that they have a safety net that actually matters, like paid family leave. Get down into the trenches in the communities with the mayors and the governors and the county officials who have to deal with these problems every day and build momentum from the bottom up. Do not go to Mitch McConnell and say, hey, let's make a deal. You're not going to get the deal you need or want that the American public needs or wants, but you've got to look past him and find people who appreciate that government needs to get working again.
Well, it strikes me, for all the differences with President Trump, that kind of grassroots pressure that, all of a sudden you're in your district and people are in your face saying, why aren't you with the president on this? That is what has worked for this president so well. We'll see if the president-elect can now harness a little bit of that energy himself. Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And one last thing. We spent the last week talking about how to unify America. Well, this might not have anything to do with politics or ideologies, but perhaps that's why he managed to unite Americans for so many years.
Here is the host of Jeopardy, Alex Trebek.
Alex Trebek died yesterday at the age of 80, a year and a half after the host of Jeopardy announced he had pancreatic cancer.
Hi, everyone. I have some news to share with all of you, and it's in keeping with my longtime policy of being open and transparent with our Jeopardy fan base.
And the secret to Trebek's success seemed to be nothing other than a genuine love of curiosity, of learning, whether you were young.
I'll take Let's Rap Kids for 200, please.
They mad, they ain't famous. They mad, they still nameless, but we still hood famous. Yeah, we still hood famous. Julia?
It was Kanye West.
Yes, and I hope I don't get an email from him.
Or maybe a little bit older.
This term for a long-handled gardening tool can also mean an immoral pleasure seeker. Ken?
What's a hoe?
No. Whoa! Whoa!
He lit up during kids' tournaments, teacher tournaments. He loved learning so much he moonlighted as the host of geography bees, which I didn't really know were a thing.
The southern part of Mount Everest is located in which Nepalese national park?
Put into terms what these fans mean to you, fans of the show.
They are the most important elements in my life outside of my family and friends.
Even when he was diagnosed with cancer, he turned that into a teachable moment, never flinching, never sidestepping.
There was one day a few weeks ago when Jeannie asked me in the morning, how do you feel? And I said, I feel like I want to die. It was that bad.
And despite all the challenges, he went back to that stage that he loved.
What is We Love You Out? That's very kind of you. Thank you. Costs you $19.95. You're left with $5. Okay.
In fact, he was working up until a week and a half ago. Jeopardy says the last episode they have banked will air on Christmas Day.
Throughout my life, I've always wondered about how courageous a human being I was. I could be scared to death, and I'd still have to deal with it. But I'm not scared to death. So maybe I am courageous.
Such an outpouring from former contestants, from just fans who DVR'd this for years. No word on who, if anyone, will host any shows after the new year. Our friends at 2020 actually aired an hour-long tribute to Trebek last night. You can check that out on abcnews.com or on Hulu. I'm Brad Milkey. See you tomorrow.